Okay, every single day, it really feels like we're just swimming in information, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. A tsunami is a good word for it.
Yeah. News headlines, social media, debates flying everywhere. It's just overwhelming, relentless, really.
Hmm.
And our mission here at the Deep Dive, well, it's to try and cut through that noise, to find the signal in all that static for you so you can walk away feeling like you've got a real handle on things.
Yeah, get properly informed.
Exactly. And today we're diving into a question that honestly it stopped us in our tracks. It's a really powerful one from a Reddit post. It asks, is the US quietly shifting from a liberal democracy to a soft authoritarian state? And most people either don't see it or don't care.
And that's precisely our aim today.
Hmm.
To really tackle this question, we've immersed ourselves in a whole stack of sources. We're talking legal scholarship, sharp news analyses, and also those, individual observations people share online, like that Reddit post.
Right.
Our goal here isn't to push any specific viewpoint,
Mm.
not at all. It's about exploring these complex ideas, impartially, really, to help you understand all the different facets, the arguments, and maybe some surprising nuances behind that provocative question.
Exactly. We're definitely moving beyond just a simple yes or no here.
Yeah.
We want to peel back the layers, look at the history, the context,
Hmm.
and uncover some, frankly, surprising insights that came up in these sources. So yeah, get ready for a hopefully nuanced and thought-provoking conversation.
Sounds good.
That Reddit post, though, it really seems to tap into a feeling maybe a lot of us have. It makes you ask, right? Does this idea of a quiet drift, maybe unnoticed, towards something like soft authoritarianism, does that resonate with what you see around you
Yeah, and the numbness part too.
in the public numbness? Yeah.
Yeah.
Are we, as a country, just quietly drifting?
Well, what's absolutely key here, I think, is the historical context. It's crucial to remember the U.S. wasn't actually set up to be a pure liberal democracy from the start.
Yep.
It was deliberately designed as a constitutional republic. It had built-in checks, specifically meant to prevent what the founders feared as, mob rule.
Right. Things like the Senate, the Electoral College.
Exactly. Those have long been criticized by some as inherently uh, anti-democratic mechanisms. And it's interesting, the founders were really wary of a big standing army and a powerful executive.
Yeah.
But our sources show that, well, presidential power has pretty steadily increased over time. And the U.S. military, for decades now, it's been by far the most expensive in the world. So those early concerns, they kind of echo, don't they?
They really do. And the picker gets even sharper, I think, when our sources start highlighting some very specific concerns. Let's maybe start with the judicial system.
Okay.
The Reddit user specifically pointed to that recent Supreme Court ruling on presidential immunity for official acts. Their argument was that it's like unprecedented, puts the Constitution at risk, makes the law more of a suggestion for a president.
Right. And what's fascinating here is the counter argument you see in some sources. It basically suggests this ruling, it just blurts out loud what already was the status quo.
Oh, interesting. How so?
Well, they point out that, no president has actually been charged for criminal acts while they were in office. Nixon is kind of the exception,
Right. Who was pardoned?
who was then pardoned by Ford. Exactly. So maybe the deeper insight here isn't that it's a totally new erosion, but maybe it's making explicit formalizing a kind of de facto reality that's mostly existed for presidents. But doing that, formalizing it, might strip away old assumptions about accountability.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Which brings us to the broader concerns that legal scholars are raising. I mean, our sources quote the American Constitution Society, saying a president has the obligation to obey the Constitution as well as court orders. And that line, the law is not whatever Mr. Trump says it is. He is not king. That's pretty stark language.
It is.
So how do these concerns and maybe specific actions like the Department of Justice making what one source called highly technical legalistic arguments to, quote, evade compliance with court orders, even calling it bad faith, how does that fit into this bigger picture of a potential, I don't know, constitutional crisis?
Well, if you connect the dots, yeah, scholars are definitely worried about a potential constitutional crisis, a situation where systematic, unconstitutional, and illegal acts
Yeah.
could fundamentally change how we even think about presidential power.
Right.
There's a real fear, mentioned in the sources, the courts might actually rule for Mr. Trump for fear that he would ignore decisions, which ironically
It's it worse.
would just make the constitutional crisis even worse. Exactly. And some sources even suggest that maybe these executive orders we see aren't just one-offs, but maybe pieces of a program for what one source actually called a mini constitutional convention to amend Article 2.
Wow. Okay, so we've talked about the judicial angle, but the sources also point to shifts in executive power itself. That seems worth a closer look, too. What did your deep dive find there?
Yeah, a key concern that pops up is an executive order looking into ways military resources could help federal law enforcement.
Okay.
And this immediately raised flags for some as a potential violation of posse comitatus.
Right. Can you just remind us what that is?
Sure. Posse comitatus is a federal law. It goes way back to 1878. And basically, it prevents the U.S. military from being used as domestic police.
Mm-hmm.
And why that distinction matters so much, even if, some sources note historically the very first president did this,
Mm-hmm.
is because the intention behind this specific order, according to our sources, is to explore ways that military resources could be used to assist federal law enforcement, potentially to silence peaceful protests.
That's the concern.
Okay, that's a critical distinction. And another thing mentioned is impoundment through the Office of Management and Budget. This is basically where the administration just refuses to spend money that Congress has already approved for something.
So, like, ignoring Congress's decision.
Effectively, yeah.
Yeah.
It nullifies Congress's constitutionally granted spending power, as one source put it.
Now, it's important to say, right, that while maybe the current administration is doing it loudly, our sources do remind us this kind of executive overreach isn't entirely new. It has deep roots.
Yeah, absolutely.
It comes up again in the Wilson and FDR administrations. FDR especially used, quote, unparalleled executive power, even threatened to pack the Supreme Court, famously.
Right.
And it's not just ancient history either. Obama and Biden also used executive power in similar ways. So it shows this isn't brand new, but maybe it's reaching a new level of intensity now.
That seems to be the argument, yeah. The frequency or the boldness, perhaps.
Yeah. So, okay, after thinking about these judicial shifts, these executive power questions, what does this all mean for, for your rights as a citizen? One of the really pervasive themes in the sources seems to be this idea of a growing public numbness, maybe, to the erosion of civil liberties, maybe made worse by just the sheer volume of exhausting drama in politics.
Yeah, numbness comes up a lot. And our sources give specific, pretty striking examples of this potential erosion. It's not just one thing. It seems like a multi-pronged thing.
Like what?
Well, think back to the Patriot Act in 2001. That opened the door to widespread warrantless surveillance, a
Yeah.
pretty big expansion of state power.
Okay, yeah.
More recently, you see things like state laws increasing penalties for protesting, which can have a chilling effect on free speech. Efforts to control what's taught in schools, banning books, limiting the ideas we can even discuss.
Curriculum battles.
Exactly. And things like bans on reproductive health access. Targeted voting restrictions, think voter ID laws, purging voter rolls, or even things like drag show bans, anti-LGBTQ laws limiting expression.
Mm-hmm.
Taken together, the sources describe these as subtle but real erosions of democratic access.
Wow, hearing that list all together, it is almost overwhelming, isn't it? Surveillance, voting, speech. It feels like that drip, drip, drip effect.
Mm-hmm.
One source actually shared this incredible analogy from a World War II historical fiction book. It really stuck with me. It said, it takes a very long time to carve out a cave. Every wave washes away just a tiny bit of the rock.
Oh, that's powerful.
Yeah, and it really highlights this idea of quiet normalization, doesn't it? The slow erosion over time of these basic institutions. Like, no single wave feels like the breaking point until suddenly you look up and realize the whole foundation's been hollowed out.
That captures it perfectly. And this seems to lead to what the sources call a third category of people. Not those who don't see or don't care, but those who notice, care, but don't think there's anything meaningful they can do to change it.
Yeah.
It's described as a state of quiet resignation, which fits right in with that feeling of watching a slow, relentless tide, just like that cave analogy.
Yeah, that quiet resignation. That feels familiar. Now, beyond the direct actions of government, the sources also raise pretty big concerns about information control and the media landscape.
Right.
The rhetoric of fake news gets mentioned and how it sounds eerily like that German term Lügenpresse, the lying press, which has, darker historical echoes.
Mm-hmm.
And there are specific actions pointed out, too, like the administration banning the Associated Press from fully covering the Oval Office or threats to cut federal funding for places like NPR and PBS.
And if you broaden that view, the Council on Foreign Relations actually reports this is a global trend. They say world press freedom continues to decline. Conditions for journalism are apparently difficult or very serious in more than half the world's countries now in 2025.
Over half.
Wow.
And our sources explain this global trend is driven by things like economic constraints on news outlets, but also a growing interest in partisan media, where people actively seek out news that just confirms what they already believe instead of challenging it.
Which leads us, I guess, to what some sources are calling an oligarchy or a tech power grab. This
Mhm.
seems like another big piece.
Definitely.
You hear about Peter Thiel's influence, Palantir's reach, including that new deal providing federal information to Google. The core idea here seems to be if essential government functions, especially data management, critical services, get concentrated in the hands of just a few private tech companies, well, that creates new kinds of control, right? Less transparent leverage.
Exactly. It raises huge questions about who really holds the power when public services are basically outsourced to private tech giants.
Hmm.
And what does that do to democratic accountability?
It's a critical point. And our sources highlight these claims like Elon Musk apparently wanting X to become a financial platform for government services, maybe even handling Social Security benefits by September.
Yeah, that was mentioned.
And this other thing about DOGE teams like cryptocurrency developers getting clearance at financial regulators like the NCUA, FDIC, FCC, those are, key agencies overseeing credit unions, banks, communications.
Right, important bodies.
The big concern that the Reddit user raised, and that our sources seem to echo, is that the lack of congressional oversight into people like Musk and Thiel getting this kind of access to government systems.
Yeah.
Well, it's verifiable and a giant threat to our system because it's consolidating immense power outside the usual democratic checks and balances.
That's the core of the anxiety, yeah, that concentration of power and data.
So all these specific examples, they really paint a concerning picture. But to really get a handle on the potential long-term direction, our sources also offer a broader view, more academic. How do courts, the very institutions meant to uphold the law, how do they actually function in systems that are already seeing these kinds of authoritarian shifts? What can we learn from looking globally?
Yeah, this is fascinating. Insights from legal scholars, Ginsburg and Mustafa, they show the courts in authoritarian regimes, they're not just mere pawns, not at all. They actually play these really complex roles.
How so?
Well, regimes often use courts to, first, legitimize their rule. They do this by keeping up an appearance of formal constitutional legality, which ironically means the courts need some degree of real judicial autonomy.
So they have to seem independent, at least a bit.
Exactly, which sometimes even allows courts to strike against the expressed will of the regime, maybe on smaller issues. Courts can also be used, though, to maintain social control, to sideline opponents, to formalize power-sharing deals between elites, and also to ensure credible commitments in the economic sphere, like protecting property rights to attract investment, even when the state is actually strong enough to just take things if it wanted to.
Right, providing some stability for business.
Yeah. And finally, courts can be used to delegate controversial reforms, basically letting the court take the heat for unpopular decisions, insulating the politicians.
So if I'm getting this right, the takeaway for you, our listener, is that even in systems leaning authoritarian, courts aren't just simple rubber stamps. They often keep just enough independence to make the regime look legitimate.
Mm-hmm.
And paradoxically, that little bit of space can sometimes be an opening for activists to challenge policies from the inside. It's like a really delicate, high-stakes dance.
That's a great way to put it, a high-stakes dance. And judges often practice what's called core compliance, meaning they tend to avoid challenging what they see as the regime's core interests. Think emergency laws, military courts, things like that.
To protect themselves.
Partly, but also to maintain their own institutional power, their ability to maybe champion rights at the margins of political life on less critical issues. And here's the odd irony the sources point out. The more deference that a court pays to executive power, the more institutional autonomy an authoritarian regime is likely to extend to it.
Wow. So being compliant on the big stuff buys you wiggle room on the small stuff.
In a sense, yeah. It's a really powerful, maybe uncomfortable lens for you to use when you look at the U.S. judicial landscape today.
Okay, so let's bring it back then to that core debate from the Reddit thread. Has this shift towards soft authoritarianism already happened? Or is it more like a dangerous trend, but we're not there yet? Our sources show, a range of opinions, including people arguing the U.S. is still not nearly as bad as in China or Russia.
Right, and putting it in global context, the Brookings Institution actually notes that the U.S. now ranks as a flawed democracy.
Flawed democracy.
And they report that generally, democracy is in decline around the world. And for the first time in decades, there are actually more closed autocracies than liberal democracies globally.
That's a sobering statistic.
It really is. And their findings also indicate something specific about the U.S. states. While partisan polarization apparently plays only a minimal role in state-level democratic backsliding, they found that Republican control of state government dramatically reduces states' democratic performance. That specific finding is from the source, highlighting a key area they identified.
Okay. Now, there are some maybe promising signs mentioned post-2020, like ongoing investigations, prosecutions for election subversion efforts.
True, those are happening.
But there's also this lingering worry in the sources that a major political party remains uncommitted to accepting legitimate electoral defeat, which feels pretty fundamental.
It does. And while some people argue, historically the pendulum swings back, things correct themselves.
Yeah, the self-correcting argument.
The sources caution against just sort of waiting for disaster to fix the problem. They point out that economic pain doesn't always wake people up. Sometimes it can actually push people deeper into fear, blame, and reactionary politics, which could just make things worse.
Right. Not necessarily a catalyst for positive change.
Not automatically, no.
So ultimately, maybe it comes back to what that original Reddit poster said so well. This whole discussion, it's about perspective, maybe not panic.
Perspective.
It's about noticing how quiet the response is sometimes and recognizing that, unplugging doesn't stop what's happening. It just delays how soon it hits home. Their goal in those powerful words was to stop flailing and swim sideways to survive the undertow.
Yeah, finding a way to navigate it, not just be swept away.
Well, this deep dive has really, I think, underlined just how complex that initial question was. Our sources, this stack we went through, they've shown a society grappling with some really significant challenges to its democratic norms, its institutions, while also giving us that crucial historical context and that framework for understanding how courts might actually work in these kinds of environments.
And it really just emphasizes how crucial critical thinking is, right?
Yeah.
And just continuous awareness, trying to navigate this incredibly complex information landscape we're all in.
Yeah.
We really encourage you always to question assumptions, consider different perspectives. It just enriches your understanding, especially when there's just so much information coming at you.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And just to leave you with one final thought today, pulled directly from the source material, something to maybe mull over as you go about your day, it's this. Freedom only works when it's protected for everyone, not just the people you agree with. Otherwise, it's not freedom, it's permission.
That's a powerful one.
Yeah. Just consider what that truly means for you and for the future.